So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled Feminist Writings, where we're looking at Donna Haraway's work, the Cyborg Manifesto, which we have started already. So we had one lecture already on this text, and we'll just continue with this in this lecture and the lectures to come as well. So we saw how at the very first, the opening of this particular work, Haraway talks about how the cyborg is a very complex organism because it's not really an organism in a pure sense of the word. It's a very important, a very interesting, a very complex combination of the organic and the inorganic orders, which get entangled in this entire production of the cyborg. And she says quite clearly that we are living in a world where we become cyborgs initially, because we live in a world where we constantly and increasingly internalize the machinic mode to the extent that we don't quite know where the organic mode ends and post-organic and the inorganic mode begins. So it becomes a very interesting combination of the man and the animal, the man and the machine, the organic and the inorganic, etc. And in the process, it does away with some of the old binaries of Western metaphysics, some of the old binaries which had historically informed and invested into the understanding of the Western sense of the self, right? So in this section, which should be on the screen, Haraway says how the cyborg is a creature in a post-gender world. It has no truck with bisexuality, pre-Oedipal symbiosis, unalienated labor, or other seductions to organic wholeness through a final appropriation of all the powers of the parts into a higher unity. So the key words over here, the operative words over here is higher unity and organic wholeness. So there is no organic wholeness that the cyborg aspires to recover. Neither does it want to appropriate any idea of a higher unity. So there's no beginning point, there's no end point. So in other words, the classical temporal tradition, which had historically informed Western metaphysics, which had, if you look at the biblical narrative, it begins with the Garden of Eden, it ends with the Apocalypse. So that temporal structure is rejected by the cyborg to a certain extent. And in that sense, it becomes a subversive formation. It becomes a very mutable, messy kind of creature, which is a constant confluence of the organic and the inorganic orders, and it does away with any kind of meta-narrative of origin, any grand narrative of salvation, etc. So all these narratives are done away with when it comes to the cyborg. So in a sense, the cyborg has no origin story in the Western sense, a final irony, since the cyborg is also the awful apocalyptic telos of the West's escalating dominations of the abstract individuation, an ultimate self untied at last from all dependency, a man in space. Now if you look at the passage I just read out, Haraway talks about how the cyborg ironically is, it emerges from the West's escalating technologization. So it becomes very much a product, very much an epiphenomenon of the increasing technologization of the Western capitalist world, which becomes increasingly technological, increasingly invaded by technology, increasingly dominated by technology. And the cyborg emerges out of that. But at the same time, it in a way subverts and revises the narrative of domination, the narrative of classification, the narrative of control and coercion that are traditionally related to the technological order. Now, so it has no origin story in a Western sense. It can be manufactured anywhere. So the cyborg is a persona, a creature, and it's important for us to understand what exactly does Haraway mean by the cyborg. I mean, does she mean the clones? Does she mean the modern drones? Does she anticipate the modern drones in terms of the drone warfare that we see experienced today? Or does she talk about how we as human beings, we as normal, quote-unquote, normal citizens, increasingly become machines, increasingly become manifested machines in a world we live in and internalize today? So it's a very complex combination of all these categories. And like any important and any significant postmodernist essay, because this is quite possibly a very interesting combination of the postmodern feminist tradition that Haraway is offering. It too becomes quite prophetic in quality, in the sense that it speaks to us today more importantly and more closely and more intimately and more really than it perhaps did when it was originally written in that native form. So this becomes in that sense a very prophetic essay. So what she's saying over here is quite clearly the cyborg is a creature, a creature of asymmetric entanglements, a creature of mutability, a creature of messiness, a creature of inorganic and organic attributes which are mingled together. And in that sense, it doesn't really have any origin, it doesn't really require any origin narrative in that sense of the word. And interestingly, she says, it's also the awful apocalyptic telos of the West's escalating dominations of abstract individuation. So it becomes an extreme extension of the West's idea of abstract individuation, individual liberty, individual consumption, private consumption, etc. So cyborg becomes an extreme extension of that order of consumption. And then in that process, it becomes an ultimate self untied from all dependency in man and space. So it becomes untied, it becomes disentangled from all the original attributes of the self, such as rationality, family, kinship, normalcy, ties, etc. So all these things become dissolved with the emergence of the cyborg. Now, what is the origin story that Haraway is describing over here, and what is the origin story which is deconstructed by the cyborg, by the manifestation, by the emergence of the cyborg? So an origin story in the Western humanist sense depends on the myth of the original unity, fullness, bliss and terror, represented by the phallic mother from whom all humans must separate. Right? So this is a very Freudian biblical origin story, which is generally and commonly consumed in a Western metaphysical tradition, that it becomes a process of separation from the mother figure, the mother as a figure of abundance, the mother a figure of fertility, production, etc. So that umbilical cord, the metaphorical umbilical cord, must be cut, must be disconnected for the origin story to begin. So the task of individual development and of history, the twin potent myths inscribed most powerfully for us in psychoanalysis and Marxism. Now, Haraway interestingly talks about how Marxism and psychoanalysis both require origin stories for their discursive formations. And she says, if you look at the cyborg politics, the way the cyborg gets mapped out in postmodern times, we are looking at an origin-less story, an origin-less narrative. So in that sense, we need to move away from classic models of Marxism, from the classic models of psychoanalysis, which have obviously been experienced as inadequate for the current times that we inhabit today. Okay, so cyborg becomes a very interesting creature which is committed to all the things which go against the Western metaphysical tradition, which go against the Western sense of the empowered, rational, holistic self. And what is that, the manifestation? What is that production principle the cyborg, operates on, or manifests, or exhibits? So this is what she says, and this should be on the screen. The cyborg is resolutely committed to partiality, irony, intimacy, and perversity. So these are very important attributes that Haraway is mapping out for us. So it is something which is, the cyborg is committed to partiality. It doesn't even aspire to be impartial. It doesn't even aspire to be universal. It doesn't even aspire to be general or generic condition. It is committed to partiality. It is committed to irony, intimacy, and perversity. So what is perversity? Perversity is an aberration of the norm, a break of the normal procedures and normal orders. So it becomes a bit of a transgressive activity, true perversion, right? So it becomes more inward-looking, an intimate, perverse phenomenon, a perverse, fluid phenomenon, which is embedded with irony. Now, I just have to spend a little bit of time on irony over here, because it's a very important category in postmodern studies and postmodern perspectives, which obviously Haraway is drawing on quite extensively in her descriptions and her theorization of the cyborg. Now, what is irony? As all of us know, irony is that figure of speech by which we say something and mean something else, right? So irony has, in some sense, a degree of semantic slipperiness. So it becomes slippery in terms of the meaning production. It can produce multiple meanings. Sometimes it can accommodate mutually contradictory meanings, etc. So irony becomes a very potent vehicle, a very potent instrument in postmodernism and the postmodernist feminist tradition, in postmodernist gender studies tradition, etc. And of course, not least, in a post-colonial tradition, where irony becomes one of the crucial categories of subversion, one of the crucial instruments of subversion, whether linguistic subversion or embodied subversion or sartorial subversion, as we know. So irony becomes a very potent, a very complex instrument through which a certain hegemonic order may be opened up, may be deconstructed, may be questioned in terms of its constructed quality. So irony is an instrument through which one can prise open the constructed quality of a particular narrative by asking difficult questions, by asking multiple questions at any given point of time. So irony is associated with multiplicity, irony is associated with ambivalence, irony is associated with a plurality of perspectives, etc. And like I said, it has a degree of semantic slipperiness, which makes it a very useful weapon in terms of situating itself against any grand narrative of meaning production. So irony, partiality, intimacy, and perversity become very important categories for the cyborg, and the cyborg is resolutely committed to all these categories. It is oppositional, utopian, and completely without innocence. Now, interestingly, look at the the way the word utopian and the way non-innocence is conflated together. So Haraway is theorizing or describing a utopia which doesn't require innocence. It's a post-innocent utopia, a post-innocence utopia. So innocence becomes a bit of a humanist tradition that Haraway is obviously moving away from. And in a sense, and I'll talk a little bit about that later, but the cyborg becomes a very good example of a post-human embodiment, right? So in a sense, it becomes an order of embodiment which problematizes some of the original ontological orders, the Western embodiment or the Western sense of self, which incorporates or which presupposes rationality, which presupposes logic, which presupposes the dualisms of man, woman, mind, body, lawful, illegal, logical, irrational, etc. So all these presuppositions, all these presupposed dualisms are done away with when it comes to the figure of the cyborg, which is oppositional, utopian, and completely without innocence. So the non-innocence of the cyborg is something which is sort of constantly harped at by Haraway over here. So no longer structured by the polarity of public and private, the cyborg defines a technological polis based partly on a revolution of social relations and the oikos, the household. So again, what we see over here is interesting. The entire distinction between the spatial distinction between the public space and the private space, it's done away with when it comes to the cyborg. And this is again a very postmodern condition where the entire ontology of the public space becomes problematized. Because we can think of the virtual world we inhabit today, we consume today as a public space. And again, this is one of the ways in which one can look at this particular essay as being quite prophetic in terms of how it connects to the times that, it seems to anticipate the times that, follows it. So the world we live in today, for instance, let's say, the different virtual worlds we have today, whether it's Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, we find that those can also be seen as examples of public space. And now we can obviously inhabit those public spaces from the very privacy of a bedroom, the very privacy of a study, from a drawing room. We don't need to leave the house that we live in privately in order to inhabit the public space. An entire binary between the public space and a private space begin to get problematized in the postmodern times. So the cyborg becomes a very good example of that problematization. And again, this is an anticipation offered by Haraway, which is quite true, which is probably truer to our times than what was perhaps when Haraway originally conceived this essay or this model of the blurring borderlines. So nature and culture are reworked. So the old ontological orders, ontological oppositional orders between nature and culture, between nature as being purely organic and culture as being purely artificial, that is done away with completely. And and this is something I may have discussed. Some of you, if you're familiar with the course that I offered last time on cultural studies, I talked about how culture is increasingly is a very complex category because it takes into account the organic and the inorganic, the material and the abstract together. And we don't quite know, it's a very asymmetric entanglement. We don't quite know how to quantify the extent to which it is original, organic, and the extent to which it is inauthentic and material in quality. That becomes a very complex entanglement, which is what constitutes culture in the first place. So nature and culture are reworked. It becomes re-ontologized in a certain sense. The one can no longer be the resource for appropriation or incorporation by the other. The relationships for forming wholes from parts, including those of polarity and hierarchical domination, are at issue in a cyborg world. So, it becomes a very metonymic activity, a very metonymic mode of operation where you work with fragments, where you work with different parts put together, and in that sense, you begin to get a sense of embodiment, but you no longer aspire for a holistic embodiment, for a whole embodiment. That myth, that fantasy of wholeness, that fantasy of completion has been done away with by the cyborg, has been deconstructed with the arrival of the cyborg in the technological times that Haraway happens to describe away here. Okay, so the relationships for forming wholes from parts, including those of polarity and hierarchical domination, are at issue in the cyborg world. Unlike the hopes of Frankenstein's monster, the cyborg does not expect its father to save it through a restoration of the garden, that is, through the fabrication of the heterosexual mate, through its completion in a finished whole, a city and cosmos. Now, this reference to Mary Shelley's novel, Frankenstein, is a very interesting reference because, in one sense, one could look at that novel as one of the first examples of a post-humanist fiction, because what happens in a novel, I'm sure most of you have read the novel, at least would know what happens in a novel. We have a scientist, a bioscientist, who aspires to create the perfect progeny, the perfect human body, which doesn't require any female agency, which doesn't require any female interventions. In other words, the female biological activity, the female biological investment in the entire process of birth has been done away with by this male scientist who wants to create this perfect progeny out of a laboratory, which is very much a male space in that particular novel. Now, obviously, that experiment goes wrong, and he ends up creating what he calls a monster, an aberration, something which really transgresses all the normative boundaries of humanness. And now, that happens through accident. It's not something he wants to create. It's not something which he desires or aims to create. He very much aims to create a perfect progeny, which doesn't happen. However, there's this residual nostalgia in the novel where the monster, the created object, the created entity, the quasi-human entity which is created, he wants to go back. He wants to fulfill himself by, through a heteronormative process. So he desires a mate. He desires, in other words, a female monster. And it promises Victor Frankenstein, the protagonist of the novel, that if you give me a female monster, I'll leave humanity, I'll live in a society which doesn't have civilization, and I'll live there forever, etc. So the desire to become a whole, the desire to become heteronormative is still there in Mary Shelley's novel. But when it comes to the cyborg in a modern world, as Harriet describes it, she says quite clearly that a cyborg does not really want a heterosexual mate. It doesn't really require any idea of heteronormativity because it doesn't really presuppose any idea of origin or any idea of the end in a world that he inhabits today. Now, the cyborg does not dream of community on the model of the organic family, this time without the Oedipal project. The cyborg will not recognize the Garden of Eden, is not made of mud, and cannot dream of returning to dust. Now, obviously, these are very biblical metaphors which are, described, which are used to describe, the design of the cyborg, as Haraway sees it. Now, the biblical metaphors are here for a reason. The metaphors over here obviously underline the human, temporal fantasy, the human fantasy of creation, the human narrative of creation, which the cyborg wants to do away with, wants to break away from completely. The myth of origin, the myth of end, the myth of salvation, the myth of redemption, the myth of creation. So these myths are deconstructed by the cyborg. And interestingly, what Haraway says is the cyborg will not recognize the Garden of Eden. It won't even acknowledge the Garden of Eden as a recognizable space because it doesn't have any sense of origin. It doesn't really aspire for any sense of origin. It can't even imagine any sense of origin. So it's not made of mud and cannot dream of returning to dust. Now, mud and dust obviously are metaphors over here, metaphors of organicity. So these are biblical metaphors, but what they serve to convey over here is the idea of the organic human body, the purely biological human body. And what Haraway says quite clearly is that the cyborg is not really a purely biological phenomenon. It's not really something which is made of mud and doesn't dream of returning to dust. This very biblical phrase, from dust will come it, to dust will return it. That cyclicity, the cyclical organicity, is something which is broken by the cyborg in that sense, in a sense that exists in the world today. Okay, so perhaps that is why I want to see if cyborgs can subvert the apocalypse of returning to nuclear dust in the manic compulsion to name the enemy. Cyborgs are not reverent. They do not remember the cosmos. Now, if you notice, if you see that the word remember comes with a hyphen over here, re-member. So the cyborgs do not remember the cosmos. And what that means essentially is that they have been dismembered. They have dismembered themselves from the cosmos, and they have no desire to remember themselves to the cosmos. So in other words, the entire organic quality about remembering, the entire organic quality about memory, where you remember yourself from something from which you've been dismembered from, that organic quality has been done away with by the cyborg. It's rejected by the cyborg completely. And this is part of the irreverence that Haraway talks about, that cyborgs are not reverent towards any idea of origin, towards any idea of completion. So they are wary of holism, but needy for connection. They seem to have a natural feel for united front politics, but without the vanguard party. The main trouble with cyborg, of course, is that they are the illegitimate offspring of militarism and patriarchal capitalism, not to mention state socialism. Now, this is a point in the essay where Haraway really historicizes the cyborg, and she says the cyborg is very much a progeny, a bastard progeny, an illegitimate progeny of military capitalism and patriarchal capitalism, militarism, military intelligence, military technology, and patriarchal capitalism, and of course state socialism. So they all have historically come together and create a cyborg. Now, the other thing that is referred to over here is that cyborgs are needy for connection. But what kind of connection is being talked about over here? Is it connection in the sense of kinship? Is it connection in the sense of affective affiliation? Or is it connection which is ironical, incomplete, and inconsequential? Well, obviously it's the latter. The ironical quality of the connection, the incomplete quality of the connection, the inconsequential quality of the connection is something which is highlighted consistently by Haraway over here. And we're not talking about connection as in family kinship or biological kinship or some kind of a continuum over here. That's not something which is aspired by the cyborg. Now, I just want to spend a little bit of time on the word trouble over here in the way that Haraway describes it. The main trouble with cyborgs. And obviously, the word trouble could be seen over here in the same sense as Judith Butler uses to talk about gender trouble. The trouble obviously has positive connotations over here. Trouble becomes transgression. Trouble becomes, and transgression obviously produces plurality, produces many perspectives, which then can become, different micro-narratives of meaning, rather than emanating or being contained by one grand narrative or meaning production. Now, the trouble with the cyborg and the reason why they're transgressive is that because they're illegitimate offspring of militarism and patriarchal capitalism, right? So the entire military intelligence, the entire military technology and patriarchal capitalism, they come together. And that's the nexus to which the cyborg has been formed. But obviously, it's an illegitimate offspring. It's not something which is desired, not something which is controlled and classified and celebrated as a natural offspring. So in that sense, this is a distinction I want to make, and this is a good point to make the distinction between transhumanism and posthumanism. Because what transhumanism is, essentially, it becomes an extension of the humanist principles, which are embedded with rationality, logic, the entire binary between man and woman, mind and body, civilized and non-civilized, acceptable, unacceptable, desirable, undesirable, legal, illegal, etc. So that dualism, that map of dualism is something which is embedded into transhumanism, which becomes a perfection of humanism in that sense. So that would have been the legitimate offspring, the legal offspring, the desired offspring of all these nexus, militarism and patriarchal capitalism. But the cyborg is an illegitimate offspring. It's something which is uncontrolled, uncontrollable. It just happened out of accident, for instance. It's undesirable. So rather than being an extension of all the humanist principles, it ends up becoming, to a certain extent, a revision, a retelling, a subversion of the humanist principles. In that sense, it becomes post-humanism quality. So this is a distinction I want to make at the very outset of this essay, that this is an essay which seems to anticipate the entire discourse of post-humanism as it is taught and consumed today. Now, because it's an illegitimate offspring, it becomes an important, a complex construct, the cyborg. But illegitimate offspring are often exceedingly unfaithful to the origins. The fathers, after all, are inessential. So the entire idea of being irreverential towards the origin, the entire idea of being irreverential towards the father becomes a very important factor, becomes a very important quality of the cyborgs, because they are completely they disregard any idea of origin. They don't require any father. They are not reverential towards the father because they don't want any sense of unity or any sense of originality. So they are a phenomenon. They are a process. They are the entire process of becoming and unbecoming, which happen at any given point of time. So that in that sense, the entire idea of the cyborg is a very transgressive process. Okay, so and then. Again, it's very historically located. Haraway is very careful to talk about the setting which produces a cyborg. So it's not really an abstract phenomenon. It's something which is produced out of a material condition of late 20th century militarism and technological capitalism. And she says quite clearly, and this should be on the screen, by the late 20th century in the US scientific culture, the boundary between a human and animal is thoroughly breached. The last beachheads of uniqueness have been polluted, if not turned into amusement parks. Language, tool use, social behavior, mental events, nothing really convincingly settles the separation of animal and human. So it's a very loaded phrase, a very loaded sentence. Let's just unpack it a little bit in order to understand what Haraway is trying to say over here. Now, what she says quite clearly is that this is a culture, a scientific culture, where the boundary between man and the animal is thoroughly breached, is transgressed. It's not something which retains its original, pure ontological orders. So human and animal boundaries, so they come together, they entangle all the time in late 20th century scientific culture. And the beachheads of uniqueness what are the beachheads of uniqueness, the instruments of uniqueness, instruments of power and control, which give unique power, unique authority, unique agency to human beings. What are those? Language, tool use, technology, social behavior, and mental events. So all these very, very core human attributes, or these very core human activities, have been polluted by the cyborg. And the word pollution over here is very interesting, because pollution is obviously anti-purity, and pollution and contamination become very important categories in cyborg politics, because it's designed against any idea of unity, any idea of purity, any idea of hygiene. So the cyborg is deliberately designed to be unhygienic by default, to be polluted, to be contaminated by default. And this contaminated, unhygienic quality is something which characterizes the cyborg in a way of its transgressive potential. So these are attributes, these core human attributes, these very holy human attributes, language, technology, social behavior, mental events, are almost turned into amusement parks. And in the process, nothing really convincingly settles the separation between animal and man. So it's not very compelling, it's not very convincing anymore, the separation between man and machine, between animal and man, in the current politics of cyborg production. Cyborg embodiment. Now, I just want to spend a little bit of time on the term amusement park, as used by Harry over here. Now, amusement park becomes a very important signifier of space in postmodern times, and not least because these are parks where play becomes a very important activity. Now, I'm not talking about play as an innocent activity over here. So these are playful activities which are heavily coded in quality. So any amusement park contains very coded machines of play, of playful consumption, of consuming through play. Now, those are non-innocent machines. Those are machines which are also transgressive in quality, which defamiliarize the normative world outside. So the amusement park becomes sort of a miniaturization, a metonymic miniaturization of the world outside. And in the process of miniaturizing the world outside, it mimics the world outside. And the process of mimicking the world outside also creates or generates an order of defamiliarization. And so this mimicry, this miniaturization, this defamiliarization, all these become very important qualities which can become potentially subversive in quality, right? So the amusement park is necessarily unholy in its qualities, necessarily non-sacred in quality. It's the entire idea of miniaturizing reality, the entire idea of mimicking reality through a hyperreal, through production of a hyperreal universe, becomes a very important condition for the postmodern amusement park. In that sense, it becomes a hyperreal, hyperactive, potentially subversive phenomena, or a subversive space, if you look at it that way. Now, so this is the quality, this is the order of transgression that is described by Haraway, and she says even hardcore, holy human attributes such as language, tool use, how do you use tools, how do you use machines, how do you use language, how do you exemplify social behavior, and more importantly, more inwardly, how do you navigate mental events. So even those human attributes, those hardcore, holy human attributes, have been done away with when it comes to the cyborg. Now, the separation between human and animal is done away with altogether, so the maps are not so clear anymore. And more importantly, Haraway says, many people no longer feel the need for such a separation. Indeed, many branches of feminist culture affirm the pleasure of connection of human and other living creatures. So this is a very important point that Haraway is making, where she's saying that some of the current thoughts on feminism, some of the current schools of feminist theory in postmodern times actually affirms and celebrates the connection between man and animal, man and other forms of living beings, other living orders. And that connection, that incomplete, inconstant, inconsistent connection becomes a very desirable condition, and it becomes a pleasurable condition to a certain extent in certain schools of feminist thoughts and certain schools of feminist culture. Now, movements for animal rights are not irrational denials of human uniqueness. They are a clear-sighted recognition of connection across a discredited breach of nature and culture. Biology and evolutionary theory over the last past 2 centuries have simultaneously produced modern organisms as objects of knowledge and reduced the line between humans and animals to a faint trace re-etched in ideological struggle or professional disputes between life and science. Within this framework, teaching modern Christian creationism should be fought as a form of child abuse. So it's a very provocative sentence, violently provocative, as you can see, that Haraway is sort of concluding with in this particular section. But let's just go back a little bit and see and unpack what she says about movement of animal rights. So this entire movement for animal rights, the entire animal right movement that has emerged along with feminism, sometimes it became a branch of feminism in a sense, the way it situates itself against the hegemony of the male, the hegemony of the male primate, in a sense that it becomes a subversive category. And these are not irrational denials of human uniqueness. So these are not like irrational movements that just come out of nowhere. These are clear-sighted recognition of connection across a discredited branch of nature, breach of nature and culture. So these seek to connect to different orders of life, different orders of existence, and just move away from any centricity, any phallocentric idea of humanness or human quality, and it instead looks at humanness or the entire idea of life form as a distributed phenomenon, as a form that connects across different kinds of attributes in a very metonymic way. Now, this reference to biology and evolutionary theory, we know obviously as a fact by now that we share, like more than 80% of a gene pool with most of the other animals on the planet, and 90% with some of the other primates who are around us. So we co-inhabit the world with animals with which we share our gene pools, majorly share our gene pools. So that any idea of human uniqueness, any idea of human exclusivity is empirically untrue, is scientifically untrue, as is demonstrated by scientific experiments over and over again. So any idea of the primacy of man because of any genetic sophistication, because of any innate biological sophistication or uniqueness is obviously erroneous, and quality is obviously scientifically untrue. And within this framework, within this discovery, within this scientific knowledge that we have today and which we should consume today, a teaching modern creation, Christian creationism that we came from Adam and Eve, we came as being uniquely created by God in the Garden of Eden. That creation story, if that is taught to children, should be classified as a form of child abuse, as a form of epistemic violence, as a form of violence on knowledge, as a form of abuse of knowledge, through which a child is indoctrinated. So obviously this is a very, very anti-Christian, a very anti-religious, anti-humanist setting that discourse position that Haraway is taking up over here. But the point she's trying to make is we need to be aware of the fact that we are living in a world where kinship systems are being reformulated, resystematized, re-theorized. So no longer would you have kinship only with humans, but we should acknowledge our kinship with machines, with inorganic attributes, with animals in a very metonymic, distributive way. Unless we can do that, we're not really being aware of the times we are living in today. Because scientifically, empirically, we have known, we have the fact, we have the knowledge that we share our genetic pool, we share biological systems through many of the forms of life around us, which include animals, which include machines, which include other forms of life. And unless we are aware, unless we acknowledge the other forms of life in the proper sense of the word, we as human beings, we live in a delusional world, which keeps getting embedded by humanist discourses, humanist dualisms, or the supremacy of man, the supremacy of mind over the body, the supremacy of the male or the female, the supremacy of man over animals, the supremacy of culture over unorganized nature, etc. Right? So this is the point that Haraway is obviously underlining quite heavily over here, and this entire idea of doing away with the creation story as a form of, and classifying it as a form of child abuse is a very provocative sentence that Haraway is deliberately offering us in her attempt to underline the point that she says that we need to acknowledge our kinship, we need to acknowledge our connectivity to all the different life forms around us today. Unless we can do that, then obviously we're living in a false faith, in a pseudo-faith, in a false belief system. And post-humanism and the cyborg does away with the belief system, does away with the entire myth of creation, the entire origin story of creation, which must be done away with if we are to live fully as an agentic selves in the postmodern world we inhabit and internalize today. So this is the point that we'll stop at this lecture, and we'll continue with this lecture, this particular text, and lectures to come. But do brush up the sections we are looking at, because those are sections which will be important for us for your examination, for your assignments, and also for your understanding of the text that Haraway is offering us to, here today. And obviously this fits into the bigger narrative of feminist writings, which is part of the course as well. So I'll stop at this point, and I'll see you at the next lecture in a short while. Thank you for your attention.